Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Debbie Madden, and I am the founder and CEO of Stride Consulting. And today we are so fortunate to have Esther Derby with us. Hi, Esther.
Hi. I
So,
see some familiar faces. Super fun.
yes, I would not be surprised if there's many people here that you have crossed paths with over the years. So I couldn't be happier to have you join us today. Before I hand it over to you, I just want to say a quick couple of things. For those that have been following the speaker series, we are more than halfway through now. And the idea that we set up back a few months ago is, how can we bring together speakers from literally around the world to help us lead through uncertain times, which, now that we're in month 4 of this thing, we know it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And we kind of knew that to begin with. And so how do those of us that are part of teams, leading teams, thinking of joining new teams, really kind of capitalize from the best practices of those that have come before us? And that's what this speaker series is all about. A quick bit about Stride, and then you won't hear anything more about Stride for the rest of this conversation. But for those that don't know us, we are an agile software consultancy. The thing that we think we do better than most is we collaborate with companies to help you use technology to solve your business problems. We meet you where you're at, and we help you get from A to B in a way that is efficient, maximizes productivity, and you'll be happy doing it. So we believe in high morale, high functioning teams. And to be honest with you, a lot of what I've learned throughout the years has actually come from Esther. So this is one of the first books on Agile I ever read was co-written by Esther, and that was Agile Retrospectives. To this day, one of my favorite books of all time. So thank you for writing that. And so without further ado, today Esther is going to be talking about learning to manage remotely, how this is going to transform how we think about practice management, right? Talk for a little while, and this is an interactive situation, so I might ask some questions. If anyone in the audience wants to ask, unmute yourself, send a message in the chat, and then we'll go from there. So Esther, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sitting here at my kitchen table. So of course it has to be, a little more informal. Guess you're all just here at my kitchen table with me. And we're going to talk about how we can think about how to manage effectively now that, we're in this situation. We've been in it for several months. And when this first happened back in March, I heard a bunch of management experts talking about how to handle this situation. And they talked about how we had to keep expectations clear, that people couldn't be slacking off just because they were at home. And there was a mad rush to get surveillance software so that managers could know every screen that people were looking at and every click and every keystroke. Right, and it would all be rolled up and reported to people so they could monitor what was going on. And I get it that people feel like they've lost control, right? I mean, we all lost control. Every single one of us was sitting in a situation of uncertainty, dealing with our contexts collapsing, like my context is collapsing right now a little bit. With people wandering into the kitchen. We're all dealing with uncertainty about how long this is going to last, how long it's going to go on. Am I going to get sick? What's going to happen? So we're all dealing in this situation of massive uncertainty. And I think for managers, there's another particular flavor to this, because there's a sense that if you can see people, you know what they're doing, right? And we can't always see what people are doing except when we're on a Zoom, right? So I think it's very easy for people to fall into thinking, I need to get some control back. I need to have this control. And that led to this sort of thing thinking about micromanagement and thinking about surveillance software, and putting in regulations like, this actually happened in a friend's workplace, that they were told that if they had to turn and attend to their child, they had to clock out. They had to take PTO if they were going to take 5 to 10 minutes to deal with a child. It led, yes, people are shaking their heads. I don't make this stuff up. People are articulating their concern that people won't work as hard. And I actually think people are really trying to do a good job, and they will continue to try to do a good job until that is squashed out of them, right? By the sense that they're being surveilled, the sense that they're not being trusted, the sense that there is no respect for the fact that their contexts are collapsing, right? That, the kids are roaming through the background. A guy I know is now managing his teams from his daughter's frilly pink playroom, right? So it's messing with people's identities. It's messing with their context. We're all in this big state of uncertainty and feeling lack of control. The problem is that the way that some folks have responded to this with increased surveillance actually erodes productivity. It erodes trust, it erodes productivity. It erodes engagement. I think we need to flip the question over and think about, how can we create more trust and how can we create more flexibility? Because people don't have the separation they had from work life to home life. It's all in the same room now. Sometimes it's with several other people with their work life going on in your room, right? So we need more trust and more flexibility. So this actually decreases anxiety for people when they feel trusted, right? They have less of a threat response, less of a defensive response. So they're going to be more able to engage. They're going to be more able to work with a clear head than when they feel threatened, right? This is just neuroscience, right? When people feel threatened, they don't do their best thinking. They don't engage best. So that's one reason to flip it over and think about how can we create trust and flexibility. The other reason is that it vastly reduces the need for supervision, which means that managers can then focus more on developing people and working on the system. And our systems have all just changed because, everyone's gone remote and all sorts of other things are happening. So having additional time to focus on how do we recreate our systems in a way that supports people doing work? How do we recreate our communication flows? How do we think about our work and our priorities now, given the current changes in our context, in our market situation, is going to be beneficial to everybody. So that all sounds well and good, doesn't it? But how do you do it? I think that there are some very practical and simple, not necessarily easy, but simple steps we can take to reinforce trust and to give people the flexibility they need to be productive in their work life while also being present in their home life. So I think the first thing to do is to really focus on clarity. So being super clear about what problem we're trying to solve for what group of people, what benefit we're creating for what group of people. The ability to articulate that, and it may be, at a story level, it may be at an epic level, it may be at a product level, gives people the information to make good decisions, right? So when they are super clear about what problem you're trying to solve and who you're solving it for, they can work far more independently, right? So I think about how is the company positioned in the market? How does the company make money? How does the product make money? Who are the customers? What's the relationship we want to have with our customers? So these things about the business context become even more important when we can't have the sort of day-to-day contact and the sort of easy opportunities to clarify and to have conversation, right? So being super clear on that kind of stuff. Transparency is another easy but not necessarily simple thing to do. And transparency can be about what the situation is for the company. You know, what's known, what's not yet known, when you might know more. I mean, if you've ever waited for a delayed flight, anybody ever had that situation? They waited for a delayed flight. You know, there's two different experiences. One is when they say your flight is delayed and then you don't hear anything for hours. Super frustrating, super anxiety producing. But the other situation is when the flight is delayed, but they give you updates every 15, 20 minutes. Even if the update is to say, we don't have any new information. We talked to the pilots, we talked to the mechanics, whoever, and they tell us they'll have an update for us in 10 minutes. So we will let you know as soon as we know, right? So the experience is dramatically different when there's that kind of transparency and periodic conversation, or even if it's just to say, we don't know yet, we're figuring it out, we'll let you know at this time, right? So that kind of transparency about the situation and about decisions that are being made reduces anxiety. It brings that anxiety down. So again, people feel more psychologically safe. They're less likely to go into a defensive stance, right? They're less likely to feel like that. Communicate across multiple channels. You know, we're used to face-to-face conversation, and to a certain extent, we can reproduce that in Zoom, but I think it's also important to have communication that isn't ephemeral. So, you know, use email, use Slack, use whatever channels you have to communicate, right? So that clarity is super important, right? One thing that I sometimes do is just create a separate channel for on whatever, you know, IM platform we're using, where people can talk about anything, you know, not work, just anything, right? And that creates, in some sense, the water cooler moments that we used to have, right? You can't reproduce it entirely, but having a channel that is dedicated to, you know, the connective tissue kind of communication, you know, that connective tissue that exists between people and their relationships, I think helps. Any questions?
I have a lot of comments, but
okay.
And one question, but I'll start off by saying one of the things that Ken Judy, Stride COO, has done. Yep. I believe he's done it in conjunction with others. So I apologize if I'm not giving people proper credit. But when we have our all hands meetings, he uses a Zoom feature where he randomly assigns us into small rooms. And we don't know who we're going to be in the room with, and it's like a present every single time. And we're thrown into this chat room with breakout rooms. Thank you, Lee Tucker, for saying breakout rooms with 3 or 4 people, and we have 10 minutes, and it really truly feels almost as if we were passing by in the kitchen. And it's for me one of the most. I look forward to it now, right? And so I love that. I love that, and I think it hits all 3 of these things, like clarity, transparency, and multiple channels. My question for you is, when you talk about focusing on clarity, right? And so how do we share that? Because what if a group of people go off, oh, we know what problem we're solving and for what group of people, and then we're all busy. So what if we forget, or what if we misremembered, or what if we forget to tell everybody else? Like, do we start just dumping stuff into Google Docs, or how do we kind of make it so that we have a record of it, or is that less important?
Well, I think people need to hear things multiple times, right? You can't just do one broadcast and then you're done with it, right? It has to be repeated multiple times in multiple different ways. I mean, there's some statistics about how often people need to hear a message to retain it. I didn't retain the exact number of the times they need to hear it, but marketing people would say you have to have 7 touches. So maybe it's, maybe it's around 7, but I think it's probably higher now because of the general level of stress, right? When people are stressed, they don't take in information as clearly, right? As effectively. So I think the other thing is it has to be talked about in the context of what we're doing, right? So I personally like to have a nice, succinct statement, the problem we're solving for what group of people, for what benefit are we creating for them. But then you have to talk about, well, what does that mean to the product we're working on? What does it mean? What does that mean relative to the feature we're working on? And I'd like people to be able to articulate it themselves in their own words.
Right. And then the counter to that, which Anna just posted a question in the chat room. She said, you can probably see yourself, but I'll just read it. Creating social channels is great, but wouldn't multiple communications be overwhelming? So yeah, how do we counterbalance? Like, I'm getting everything from Slack and email and Google Docs, and that's a double-edged sword there, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the issue is cognitive load, right? So if people have to figure out, which of 800 different repositories do I look at? That's high cognitive load. If they have to figure out, who on earth do I go talk to get some information about this? That's cognitive load. If they have to research through, half a dozen papers to understand, why we're building this or why we're providing this service, that's cognitive load, which is one of the reasons I think that short, snappy statement is important, right? So yeah, it can be overwhelming. And so you need to think about the cognitive load issue, right? How much friction are you creating in the communication, and keep it to, not too many channels. And if you have a lot, have an index.
Yeah. And I think
that's old technology. Indexes are old technology, but they're quite useful.
Yeah. And I think I'm seeing some comments in the chat. I appreciate everyone for joining in here. And I think one of the things to Esther's point earlier about the how do you get communications when your flight is delayed? That was such a nice, simple, yet obvious, light bulb moment for me. One of the things that I've seen work well is having a regular cadence with an agenda, so that every 2 weeks, company-wide updates you'll hear in this format. Every week, planning sessions. So you kind of in your own head compartmentalize, and you expect that if something's going on at the company level, if I'm not on top of every single Slack message, I know I will hear the most important things at a minimum every 2 weeks.
Yeah, and I think that cadence is super important.
That predictable, I'm showing up and what am I expecting to learn in these?
Yeah.
And then I just want to, I'm sorry if your name is Sid or Sid. I might be getting that wrong, but communicating in multiple channels will help people with cognitive load because they wouldn't need to figure out where to find it. They would just get information from the channel they prefer. And I think that's along that's along those lines of setting the expectations. If I want to learn about marketing, I'm going to read the marketing channel. If I don't, then I'm out, right?
Yeah. So I want to go back to something you said about cadence, because we are in this situation of high uncertainty, and that cadence gives people something to hold on to, right? That's creating some sense of certainty. And it may not cover the whole situation. It may just be, we know that at this time, we're going to get some information. We're going to be able to ask questions. We're going to be able to get some further clarification about stuff. So even that sort of certainty, that temporary structure, can be super helpful to people dealing in times of uncertainty.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think this is another thing that we have to really step into right now, is providing robust technology support. I still run into teams that are expected to deal with collaborative work using only a Polycom, which people still remember Polycoms. Do you still have those? Yes, people have them. Those things that look like big spiders on the center of the table, right? And you know, you can have a productive collaborative space with only access to phone. And actually, I see J. Allen Morris is here. She knows a lot about creating wonderful collaborative remote spaces. So everybody look at J. Allen and make a note of her name, because she just her book came out, what, last week? Was it just last week that it came out?
Yeah, end of 30th of June.
Yeah, so and it's about remote facilitation and creating collaborative remote spaces. So yes, technology support. So many companies have rules around what kind of tools you can use for security reasons. And I think this is a time for managers to step in and say, what's the trade-off here? You know, what is the security concern here? How can we meet it? How can we articulate security practices so that we can open up our tool set a little bit and still be mindful of proprietary customer data, proprietary company data, and just the security issues, because you just don't know whether someone is working in a household where there are other people working for another firm who may be overhearing things. So, I mean, we have to articulate the security practices in any case, but if we can at the same time try to open up the tool set, if your company has things super locked down, I think that's helpful. I run into to me, astonishing number of people who are not able to use even basic collaboration tools.
And not only that, but the tools themselves are changing. Like I myself just learned yesterday that you can now whiteboard on Zoom. That feature may have been available forever, and I just learned about it yesterday, and I thought that I like understood how to use Zoom, right? And and so even the tools, the companies whose tools we are using are going to be iterating rapidly.
Yeah.
So
Right.
really just kind of constantly checking back, because you know there are new, you know, there's going to be in the next 6 months, I'm sure, lots of innovation here.
An explosion. So the other side of that is that I think you have to be a little careful introducing new tools, because I mean, we like the shiny stuff, you know, it's oh no, cool feature. So it's really tempting to introduce them because they're cool, but it makes more sense to introduce them because they serve a purpose for what a particular group needs to accomplish, right? So robust technology support. And then I think we need to really reconsider what work really needs to be synchronous, where we need to be in a setting like this, and what work can be asynchronous. Because frankly, it is exhausting to be on Zoom meetings for 8 hours a day. It is just exhausting, right? And there's a lot of reasons this is true. It has to do with the focal length. It has to do with shifting our, you know, where our focus is. It has to do with not having breaks in between. It has to do with the light. There's a whole ton of reasons. Sometimes meetings are not particularly engaging. So, so being judicious about how much time we expect people to spend in these video spaces. And that ties back to the clarity thing, right? Because if we have clarity, then, you know, we can work more effectively asynchronously, right? If we have clarity about not just what we're doing, but how we are allocating the work amongst ourselves. Who's going to be working on what parts are we working on together? What parts, you know, am I going to go off and work on this for a day and then come back and talk about what I've discovered or what I've accomplished. So being really thoughtful about what really requires us to be in these remote spaces, and then making them as engaging as possible. I mean, I think often people try to recreate, you know, just to port a face-to-face thing into a remote space. You know, we'll just take whatever we were doing and we're going to do it remotely. And I don't think that's possible. I think you have to really work on creating the best remote event you can. Creating the best remote meeting that you can create. And there's lots of ways to do that. There's a lot of ways to engage people. Read Jay Allen's book and Kirsten's book, because they have a ton of ideas. They've been working on this for a number of years. So think about how can we really create a really robust and engaging remote space when we need to work together.
And I think for me, as part of that, giving people permission to say this meeting is no longer as effective as it used to be. So it's okay to stop. I think the meeting overload happens when you just keep adding on, and the new ones are good, but the old ones just need to go away. And people are afraid to say, like, I had a stand-up that I just recently, yesterday, I was doing it every single day, and it was only taking 15 minutes, but I was like, guys, this is not a good use of our time. And everyone's like, oh, thank God someone said it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
be willing to just stop if it's not working, right? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that makes sense. I mean, you know, our workflows have changed. Our information flows have changed. The way we're coordinating work has changed. So it makes sense that the way we have meetings should change, right? And just make the most of them that you can, because it's just, otherwise it's just so exhausting. Does anyone else feel that way, that it's like exhausting to be on remote meetings for 8 hours a day? Yeah, it's just, it's, you know, there's something about it, right? So think about what has to be online, and then do your very, very best to have an engaging remote space. Yeah. So the other thing that I you know, when I talk about creating sort of trust and flexibility that freaks people out is they're afraid people will just run amok and they'll go do crazy things, which points to the need to have some boundaries or constraints, right? So one thing that people, when they are used to giving direction and delegating tasks, they don't necessarily have to think about what are the edge cases here, right? It's just, it's not something that comes up when you're handing over a discrete piece of work, right? But when you are in the situation where you're now, where, you know, we can't have those conversations that we used to have necessarily as frequently or as spontaneously. Creating those boundary conditions or articulating them helps people know that, okay, this is the outcome we want, and these are the ways that we could do it that would actually be abhorrent, and these are the ways that would be desirable. You know, so these are all the ways that, oh yeah, we could solve it this way, but it's a bad idea, versus these are, you know, this would be great. That creates a sort of space where people can really get incredibly creative. So I think so we actually work this way in real life a lot. You know, thinking about the boundary conditions. So if anyone's ever planned some sort of family party or event, you have had to think in terms of boundaries and constraints. Right. So you set a time, right? And that's going to drive certain patterns of behavior. You know, you have an afternoon party versus an evening party, that's going to influence certain kinds of behavior. If you have an open bar or a closed bar, if you know your uncle who comes, who always drinks too much, you might have a closed bar, you know. So there's all sorts of things we think about in these, you know, setting boundaries in our day-to-day life, but we're just not as familiar with using them in our work life. If you think about games are essentially a set of constraints. Forms of poetry are a set of constraints, right? Haiku is actually has quite rigid constraints, but there's incredible creativity that comes from those. You know, and in some ways more creativity than if you didn't have the constraints. If you just write this, you know, try to evoke this feeling in prose versus trying to say it in a haiku, you get a very different result. So I think focus on the outcomes, having that kind of clarity, and then having the boundaries about, oh, this would be abhorrent, we don't want this, and ooh, this would be good. Sometimes I talk about this in terms of stories. You know, we want to hear more stories like this and fewer stories like that. But that gives people that room where, you know, they can bring their creativity. They know what needs to be accomplished. It may not be exactly how the manager would have done it. It might be much better. Right. It might, I mean, people come up with such creative ideas, things that I never would have thought of when I set boundaries and constraints this way. So that's the part that goes with the clarity, right? So we can create this situation where people can actually work with flexibility in the time that they have under the conditions we're in, right? Creating enough safety for people to really still engage and be productive. And the other boundary I think is super important is, how do we put boundaries around our own time and our own energy, right? Because it's all happening at once, right? Family, work, all of it's going on. So how do we put boundaries so we're not working all the time, or we're not distracted all the time, or that we know that, you know, this thing that used to take me a day, it's going to take me 2 days, and that's got to be okay, right? That's got to be okay.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest personal surprises was after I had been working from Zoom for about 2 weeks, I realized that my ability to be productive, that window shrank, right? The life story I told myself about myself was I could get up and work from 8 to 8. Not that it was as good practice, but I told myself the story that I could do it. And then I simply couldn't. I simply was too tired, and that surprised me, and then that made me anxious.
Yeah.
And I was so concerned about, you know, supporting others, and I forgot to set those boundaries for myself. So, and people are saying in the chat, constraints are liberating, not only for others, but I think for me personally. As soon as I set a very specific constraint for myself, my whole mental attitude changed, and it was like I was my old self again.
Yeah.
And that was surprising to me. I don't know if that resonates with you, Esther, or anyone, but.
Well, I think that I mean, on some level, we've all been through a trauma, right?
Right.
This was a huge trauma, and that we're still going through. We're just learning how to deal with it better. But so having the normal expectations about what other people can do and what you can do yourself doesn't respect the fact that we're in this state of trauma. I know for me, the first couple of weeks, my attention just skittered. Right, it was hard to focus. My energy's been different, and I hear that from a lot of people. I hear from a lot of people that their sleep patterns are different. You know, they may need more sleep. They may sleep less at night, but they sleep during the day for a short period of time. And I think we have to respect that, right? So someone asked me a while ago if you don't know what people are doing, they might be sitting on their couch playing a video game. It's like, well, I don't, okay. If that's part of their way they're managing their energy, if that's part of the way they're managing their concentration, if that's part of the way they're managing their flow in this period of trauma, I'm okay with that. We're focusing on outcomes, right? As long as we're achieving outcomes and focused on that, let people have that flexibility to deal with the energy flow and the concentration flow that is under disruption now because of the situation we're in.
Right. And I think people jump over what they've gained here in terms of if a given team is no longer spending time in transit to work, to a meal, to a meeting, people still need that mental break. So whether we take, I get up and from time I'm awake to time I'm working, it's now 15 minutes instead of 2 hours, right? I'm going to still need that time throughout the day, right? It said it's not true that we're necessarily a net negative here, right? We are losing in-person collaboration, so that's an interesting thing to think about. But in terms of time and commitment, people are probably spending too much time working. Right?
Well, I can guarantee you that there is some manager somewhere in the world who is saying, well, now that you don't have a commute, you should spend those extra hours working.
Oh, I guarantee you there's many. There's many.
And I think that's, that ties back to this notion that the manager's job is to get people to work hard, which I think a manager's job is to create an environment where people can work creatively on solving the problems that need to be solved. Effective teams very often make difficult problems look easy, right? But we have this notion we're tied to that people have to work hard.
Yeah. I want to, there's a lot going on in the chat. And if I've missed your question.
Oh yeah. I'm actually having trouble reading the chat for some reason today.
I'm going to read it for you. Don't worry about it. So
okay.
I'm going to try. I might not get this perfect, but one question I want to call out. The things you mentioned are simple, but not necessarily easy.
Yeah.
What is it that might make them not easy for the people in charge? And what ways have to guide those in charge through what might not be easy for them? So thank you, Olaf, for the question.
Olaf always asks me difficult questions.
All right.
For which I truly appreciate him. It's an important point because people's identities are often tied up in their roles. And so now I'm going to have to tell you a little story. I have a million of them. So I did some work with a group a while ago where we're trying to have the teams be more empowered and step into their roles more effectively. And one group of managers looked at the decisions they made and said, oh, we can send all these, the team can make these decisions. They have everything they need to know to do that. We need to be involved with these, we jointly make these decisions. And there's a few decisions we have to continue to make ourselves. And another group really did not want to let go of any decisions because they felt like if we're not the decision makers, if people don't have to be coming to us all the time to ask for information or permission or decisions, what will we do? We won't be valuable anymore. So, I get it that that identity as a manager and your conception of what a manager does can make it hard. So what I try to talk about is what parts of management are truly strategic and what parts, with a little bit of transfer of knowledge, with setting better context, with setting better clarity, teams could do. And then the managers can focus on more strategic stuff like working on the system and developing people, right? Day-to-day task supervision is not strategic, right? So I want to open up a much more strategic role for managers, and that is valuable to the system, right? Valuable to them, valuable to the company, valuable to the system. And I find that helps people shift from, well, if I'm not making all the decisions, what do I do? It's like, you'll make a decision, you'll make it about different stuff in a different way. It's far more valuable to the company. But yeah, it can be hard for people to let go. It's that control thing, and it's the identity thing.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, which, you can't cover in a few minutes, but how do you help managers identify the candidates for letting go, for those that are afraid? Is it the ones that have the tightest feedback loops where you can, okay, you could be scared, but in a week you're going to know? Or is it the ones that are like, is there any kind of triage you can do there, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, no, I mean, that's one of the questions, right? So what's the risk? What's the feedback loop? Mm-hmm. Where are people's skills and knowledge, right? If they don't have the knowledge, you can provide information, you can educate, you can give people more context. If people don't have the skills, you can work on the skills. So it's not like you dump every decision all at once, right? You do have to be, you have to exercise some discretion about it. It's a little wire we have to walk, right? And people either tend to fall into, well, I have to hold them all, or I'm gonna abdicate, and that's not helpful either. So what you brought up, like what's the feedback loop, what's the risk, where are people's skills? Those are the things to consider. And I also ask managers, what is the really strategic stuff you would like to work on, but you don't have enough time to work on? And every manager I know has a list like that.
You just said that, it just triggered in me to I wanted to write. I was like, I know the answer.
Yeah, every manager has a list like that. And sometimes focusing on that, it says, well, okay, so what stuff, what can reasonably done by the team, not just to shove work onto them, but to reduce friction, to reduce bottlenecks, to reduce handoffs, to make their work more effective. So it's not just about, delegating everything to somebody else to get it off your plate. It's about, how can we reduce the friction and create more flow for the teams and free up management time to work on more strategic stuff.
And also, in many cases, that increased real autonomy leads to increased engagement and increased happiness of the teams, because they actually feel, oh, you are trusting
Absolutely.
me. Let me take this thing to the end, right? And so, yeah. Yeah,
the situations where I would say, like, this is a blanket statement. This is a blanket statement, but my sense of people in our field, in the software field, is we have a fairly high need for autonomy. That's something we tend to value. I don't like people telling me what to do. The situations I see where people want to be told what to do is when they have been told to take initiative, they have taken initiative, and then they've been slapped. So it's a risk aversion strategy,
Right.
right? And that happens when people haven't set the boundaries, right? When they haven't talked about, so, this is the outcome we want. These are the, this is the playing field, anything in that playing field, okay. And if you come up with something that you're questioning, well, we'll have a conversation.
So I want to read a question that's been
Sure.
answered. It's a question about retrospectives. So
I have some opinions on that.
Have you thought about how this remote situation has shifted how you think of team retrospectives and the framework you and Diana Larson wrote about? Are some parts of the framework more important in a remote setting? What would you change about the framework if you wrote that book today? So there's three parts of that question, but answer it as you wish.
So I actually thought about this a lot when I did my online retrospectives course. So I know at least one person on this is familiar with the course. So I talked about what are the principles that you need to apply to have an effective remote retrospective. And Jay Allen also has principles in her books for remote meetings, and there's a lot of overlap between them. But you have to think about how can we design to equalize participation. I mean, I think that is the foremost thing. How can we create an environment where everybody's voices are heard? And in some ways, that's easier when everybody's remote than it is when part of the group is in the room and part of the group isn't, right? So design to equalize participation. I have 8 principles. Only one of them is in my head at the moment. I could look them up, but yeah, anyway, so replace visual cues, because, we just don't have as much bandwidth. There's a number of principles you can apply to make your meetings better. I would actually do the same framework. There are some things I would think about differently in terms of, for example, data. Right. I think you have to pay a lot more attention to collecting data before you get into the meeting when you're in a remote situation, particularly if it's quantitative data. And make sure people have it ahead of time. Make sure that all your links are available to people ahead of time so that people can be looking at things. But I would actually stick to the same framework, but I would apply principles for an effective remote meeting to do it. And take advantage of whatever collaboration tools you can. I mean, don't you guys have a little free remote retro tool?
We do actually, and I did just drop it in the notes in the chat for anyone interested, but thank you for calling that out. And it really is, it's called remoteretro.org, and it's open for the public, and it really just is a collaboration tool. It's not,
Sure.
It's something anyone has to buy, but it's available to make those things a little bit easier when you're not in the same room. So again, going back to your use technology, it does rely on the humans and preparing and being clear on the outcomes. All of that also has to be in place. There is no magic tool, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I did a workshop with Agile 42 South Africa, Joe Perold, and Jalen and Kirsten a few weeks ago. And I learned to do things with Google Slides that I had not even dreamed of. So, if you have a tool, that's great. But if you have access to Google Slides, you can actually do some pretty incredible things.
Awesome. So I want to keep an eye on the time. I mean, this has been, it's been almost an hour and it feels like it's been 10 minutes. So that's amazing.
It's been fun talking with you.
There's been one more, I want to raise one more question in the chat group. And then what I'm going to do after this is I'm going to put up Esther's contact information for anyone that has questions for her following this, both her website and her email. So Esther, the last question is, from Brian, I find that managers often don't know how to make the system better or don't themselves feel empowered. So they only feel important by micromanaging. How do you help them see and embrace a more strategic role or perspective?
Well, I do it when I'm, in conversation with people, through conversation and showing people ways to work on the system. Right.
Yeah.
So you're right. A lot of people have not been taught how to take a systems view or how to think about working on the system. But this is another thing that I think we know more about it when we're away from the office than we do when we're at the office, right? Because we if we have problems in the household, we look at well, what's contributing to this, and we start working on the contributing factors, right? We do problem solving around, so the kid is always, scrambling around in the morning, late, rushing around, trying to get, so then we figure out, well, okay, how can we put some external reminders in place? How can we reduce some of the friction? How can we, how can we make it easier for the kid to be organized? How can we help create a little system? I mean, so people do that.
Yeah.
And it's the same principles, it's the same thought processes in a lot of ways. You look at, okay, what contributes to this pattern? I mean, you could blame the kid. That's not going to work. You're going to have to pay for years of therapy if you do that. So we know how to do it. And there's some differences in, the way I might think about it in an organization. But, a lot of it is the sort of what's contributing to this, what can I influence, what can I not influence?
Yeah.
Making small changes.
Yep.
So,
I hear you. I hear you. All right. So what I want to do, unfortunately, Esther, we are, and I say unfortunately, I mean, I can't believe how fast this hour went. So we do have to wrap up. But I want to, before we go, just throw this up there. If anyone has any questions for you, they can go to your website, estherderby.com, or email you at derby@estherderby.com. And then if anyone has questions for me, you can reach me at Debbie at Stride NYC or at stridenyc.com. Diana Larson, who actually wrote Agile Retrospectives with you, is our next speaker, July 16th. So tune in for that. Sign up on Stride's website. And thank you, Esther. I couldn't.
Yeah, I could spend the whole afternoon talking with you.
Kind of fun. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Hope you guys.
Thanks for sitting around my kitchen table with me.
All right, everybody, have a great day, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.